You mentioned in the preface some of the overlap that this book has with your previous books, particularly Better Never to Have Been. How do you see the human predicament placed within your larger body of work?
It's a hard question to answer because I work on topics that are unrelated to this. But with reference to Better Never to Have Been, the conclusions of the human predicament are the same, the antinatalist conclusion. But the human predicament deals with a much larger number of questions and in more detail. So I look at life's big questions, the questions about whether life has meaning, about whether death is bad for us, whether we're better off taking our own lives, whether immortality would be good. Those are life's big questions, and those are the ones that I encounter or handle head on in the human predicament.
Can you give a brief summary of your views of optimism versus pessimism?
Well, one can be optimistic or pessimistic about a range of things. And in the context of the human predicament, the optimism or pessimism is about the questions relating to the human predicament. Sometimes when people use the word optimism or the word pessimism, they mean too optimistic or too pessimistic, too good or too bad. And I want to use those terms in a more neutral sense. So one might give an optimistic answer, but it might not be too optimistic. It might be that a positive outlook is in fact the correct one with respect to a given question. So on that understanding, a view as being optimistic or pessimistic counts neither in its favor nor against it. So it's just a descriptor of the kind of position, and then it's a separate question as to whether it's correct or not. And I take pessimistic views about most of life's big questions, but not all of them. And I happen to think those pessimistic answers are correct.
What is the distinction between meaning and value when it comes to human lives?
Well, when I use the term value in a life, to say that life is valuable, what I mean is that we ought not to take that life, that there's something of value there that we would lose if we were to take that life. It's possible for a life to be devoid of all meaning and yet be valuable. So somebody might be leading a meaningless life, and yet it might be wrong for us to go and take those lives, take that life, kill that person. So the meaning is the point of the life, the purpose of the life, the significance of the life, and the value can include value just to the person, him or herself. And it might be valuable for an individual and wrong for us to kill them.
There are some interdisciplinary aspects to your work, such as medicine and bioethics. Can you talk a bit about that?
Well, I think when one looks at philosophical questions that have a practical import, one needs to look at the real world and look at the evidence that the various sciences can provide for answering one's philosophical questions. And so insofar as I am looking at practical questions, so questions about, for example, what people find meaningful in their lives, or when people are inclined towards suicide, it is important to be familiar with the psychological and other evidence that there is. And I do sometimes refer to that. I think I refer to it a little less in the human predicament than I do in some other work. But how much I do really depends on the question. So insofar as you need to look at the empirical sciences, then I do that. Insofar as one doesn't need to answer the philosophical question, then obviously I don't.
Describe the influences and philosophical lineage that led to your work in the human predicament.
That's also a difficult question to answer because people often ask me what my favorite philosopher is or who my favorite philosopher is. And I don't really have one. I think different philosophers have shed light on different questions and say something illuminating to say about different questions. These particular questions, I think, sort of predate, for me, as I suspect for most people, formal engagement with philosophy. I'm sure most people think about these things from much before they go to college or much before they begin to read philosophy books. And so it's been a long time that I've been thinking about these things, and I tend to have a rather grim view of them. And so that's probably the main motivation, kind of a burning inside to grapple with these questions in greater detail and more carefully. And along the way, I've no doubt I've read lots of philosophers who've had things to say and learnt a lot from doing so and try to push things just a little bit further.
How have philosophy's concepts and ideas about meaning in human lives changed over time?
Well, in some ways they have changed and in some ways they haven't. There are people today who have views about the meaning of life that would, in broad outline, be indistinguishable from views that were held hundreds of years ago. And then there are other people who have very different views, distinctly modern views about these questions. So I'm not sure that the premise of the question is true, that they have always changed, but there certainly are people today who have views that would have been quite unusual in another time and in another place.
Do you have any practical tips to help cope with the human condition?
I do, and I've tried to provide some of those in the book. Perhaps they're not going to be as helpful as people want, in part because I think how one copes with it is not simply a matter of cognition, it's also really a matter of temperament. And I think some people are blessed with the sort of temperaments that make it easier for them to cope with this, and other people have temperaments that just make it so much harder. Now, I think some people's temperaments actually lead them not to engage honestly with the human predicament. They're so much in denial about it that the way they cope is through a form of denial. But of those people who take what I would take to be a clearer view of these questions, some I think are crippled by their answers to them. In other words, they sort of become dysfunctional as a result. It's almost too much for them to bear. And that's an immense cost for people of that kind. Others, I think, manage to keep the reality before them while also managing to keep functioning, to keep moving, to keep living, as it were. And it's that latter view that I'm recommending. Of course, I don't have any tips in the book about how one can change one's temperament and how one can be a different sort of person in that sense. But that, I think, is the ideal, to keep the reality before one and to try to remain functional in the light of it. But also not to have any more children, or not to have any children in the first place, so as not to replicate this giant tragedy.
How do meaning of life and quality of life factor into the human condition?
Thank you. It's an interesting question, and some people, I think, would see the meaning of life as part of the quality of life. Certainly, if you're speaking about the felt meaning of life, that is going to be part of the quality. It's hard to imagine somebody's overall quality of life being really good if they were miserable about the meaning, if they felt that they had no meaning. But meaning is not the only feature of quality of life, if it is part of the quality of life. There are many other features, just your sort of physical comfort or discomfort, whether you've got ill health or good health. And so I think that's a much broader category. Sometimes it might be helpful, as I do in the book, to separate out a meaning of life and quality of life, just to think about those sorts of concepts separately. But I'm not averse to seeing meaning as part of at least subjective meaning, as part of the quality of life. There are also varying ways of understanding quality. So sometimes people understand quality in a very subjective way. So how does it feel to the person whose life it's being led? And if you're using the term in that sense, and you're wanting to see where meaning of life slots in, well then if you're speaking about what meaning there actually is rather than what there's felt to be, then the meaning of life and quality of life are going to come apart again.